Emily's heart raced as she stepped into the ballroom, her dreams of graceful pirouettes and elegant waltzes filling her mind. But little did she know, behind the glittering chandeliers and polished floors lurked a nightmare that would shatter her innocence forever. In just moments, the 8-year-old's world would be turned upside down by a horrifying act of racism that no child should ever have to endure. What transpired in that dance studio would spark a citywide scandal and forever change how Emily saw the world around her. Emily's small hands gripped the edge of her dresser as she twirled in front of the mirror, her oversized t-shirt billowing around her like a makeshift tutu. The 8-year-old's eyes sparkled with joy as she imagined herself as a graceful ballerina, her movements still clumsy but filled with unbridled enthusiasm. "Mama! Mama!" Emily called out, her voice echoing through their modest apartment. "Can I please take dance classes? Pretty please." She rushed into the living room, where her mother sat hunched over a pile of bills, her forehead creased with worry. Emily's mother looked up, her expression softening at the sight of her daughter's hopeful face. "Baby, I don't know," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Those classes can be expensive, and I'm not sure if we can afford it right now." Undeterred, Emily continued her plea. "I promise I'll be good, Mama. I'll do all my chores and get straight A's in school. Please." Her lower lip trembled slightly, her eyes wide with longing. As days passed, Emily's passion for dance only grew stronger. She spent hours watching YouTube tutorials, mimicking the movements of professional dancers. In the cramped space between the coffee table and the TV, she practiced her plies and arabesques, her face scrunched in concentration. One evening, as Emily's mother returned from work, she paused in the doorway, watching her daughter twirl and leap across the living room. Despite the lack of formal training, there was a natural grace to Emily's movements, a raw talent that couldn't be ignored. Emily's mother felt a tug at her heart. She remembered her own childhood dreams, left behind due to circumstances beyond her control. In that moment, she made a decision. The next day, after tucking Emily into bed, she stayed up late into the night, poring over the family budget. She made calls, negotiated payment plans, and even picked up an extra shift at work. It would be tight, but she was determined to make it work. A week later, as Emily sat at the kitchen table, half-heartedly pushing her vegetables around her plate, her mother cleared her throat. "Emily," she began, trying to keep her voice casual, "how would you like to start dance classes next month?" Emily's fork clattered to the plate as her eyes widened in disbelief. "Really, Mama? For real?" Her voice trembled with excitement. Her mother nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "For real, baby. I found a studio that offers beginner classes," and before she could finish, Emily launched herself across the table, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's neck. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she squealed, peppering her mother's face with kisses. As they embraced, Emily's mother felt a warmth spread through her chest. The sacrifices would be worth it to see her daughter's dream come true. The days leading up to Emily's first class were a whirlwind of excitement. They shopped for dance shoes and a leotard, Emily twirling down the aisles of the store, unable to contain her joy. At home, she practiced her positions in front of the mirror, imagining herself in a grand ballroom. On the morning of her first class, Emily woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. She carefully laid out her new dance clothes, smoothing every wrinkle with trembling hands. As she and her mother prepared to leave, Emily's stomach fluttered with a mix of excitement and nerves. Little did they know, the joy of this moment would soon be overshadowed by an experience that would change Emily's life forever. As Emily and her mother pulled up to the dance studio, the imposing brick building loomed before them. Large windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, momentarily blinding Emily as she stepped out of the car. Her heart raced, a mix of excitement and apprehension coursing through her small body. The sound of classical music drifted through the air as they pushed open the heavy glass doors. Emily's grip on her mother's hand tightened instinctively. The studio's polished wooden floors gleamed under bright fluorescent lights, and the scent of sweat and perfume mingled in the air. A group of children, all older than Emily, huddled near the far wall, their voices a hushed murmur that stopped abruptly as Emily and her mother entered. Emily felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes upon her. She shrunk closer to her mother's side, suddenly aware of how different she looked from the other children. Their leotards were pristine, their hair pulled back in perfect buns. Emily tugged self-consciously at her own leotard, wondering if she had put it on correctly. A tall woman with strawberry blonde hair pulled into a severe bun approached them, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. This must be Ms. Hartley, Emily realized, her stomach clenching with nervous energy. "Welcome." Ms. Hartley's voice rang out, warm and inviting. Her smile was broad, revealing perfectly straight white teeth. "You must be Emily. We're so excited to have you join us today." Ms. Hartley's welcoming demeanor seemed to melt away some of Emily's anxiety. The instructor's kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she bent down to Emily's level, extending her hand. "I'm Ms. Hartley. Are you ready to dance?" Emily nodded shyly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She loosened her grip on her mother's hand, feeling a surge of bravery. "Wonderful." Ms. Hartley straightened up, addressing Emily's mother. "We'll take good care of her. Our beginner class runs for an hour and a half." Emily's mother nodded, checking her watch. "Perfect. I have some errands to run, so I'll be back to pick her up then." She turned to Emily, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "You're going to do great, sweetheart. Remember, Mama loves you." Emily hugged her mother tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. As they pulled apart, Emily felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but she pushed it down. This was her chance to be a real dancer, just like she'd always dreamed. "I love you too, Mama," Emily whispered, her voice small but determined. Emily's mother gave her one last encouraging smile before turning towards the exit. Ms. Hartley gently placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her towards the group of children. Emily took a deep breath, straightening her back like she'd seen ballerinas do in videos. The studio door closed behind Emily's mother with a soft click, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Emily felt a momentary pang of loneliness, but Ms. Hartley's warm presence beside her provided comfort. As they approached the other students, Emily lifted her chin, ready to take her first steps into the world of dance. Little did she know, the welcoming atmosphere was about to shatter, revealing a harsh reality that would test her resilience in ways she could never have imagined. Emily's excitement turned to confusion as she noticed the other children whispering and staring. The air in the studio suddenly felt heavy, charged with an energy she didn't understand. Why were they looking at her like that? As Emily stood nervously in the center of the room, Ms. Hartley's voice cut through the tension. "All right, class. Let's pair up for our warm-up exercises." The other children immediately began to gravitate towards one another, forming pairs with practiced ease. Emily's heart raced as she looked around, hoping someone would approach her, but no one did. The seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity to Emily as she remained alone in the middle of the studio. She could hear snippets of hushed conversations around her, and one voice cut through clearer than the rest. "I don't want to dance with her," a boy whispered to his partner, shooting a glance in Emily's direction. Emily's chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She didn't understand why no one wanted to be her partner. Was it something she had done? Was her leotard on wrong after all? Ms. Hartley's gaze swept across the room, her smile fading as she noticed Emily standing alone. The warm, welcoming demeanor that had greeted Emily earlier seemed to evaporate. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she approached Emily. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as Ms. Hartley drew near. The instructor's expression was stern, almost irritated, as she looked down at Emily. Gone was the kind woman who had bent down to shake her hand just moments ago. "Emily," Ms. Hartley said, her voice clipped and impatient. "You need a partner for the exercises." She scanned the room, her gaze falling on a girl with long blonde hair who was chatting with a friend. "Sarah, you'll partner with Emily for now." Sarah's smile faltered as she looked at Emily, then back at Ms. Hartley. "But I always partner with Megan," she protested, her voice carrying a whine. Hartley's expression hardened further. "Sarah, now. We don't have all day." With visible reluctance, Sarah shuffled over to Emily. She kept her distance, barely meeting Emily's eyes as they stood side by side. Emily tried to smile at her new partner, but Sarah just stared at the floor, her body language screaming discomfort. As the class began their warm-up exercises, Emily struggled to keep up. The movements that had seemed so graceful and effortless when she practiced at home now felt clumsy and uncoordinated. She watched Sarah out of the corner of her eye, trying to mimic her movements, but everything felt off. Emily's feet tangled as she attempted a simple step, nearly losing her balance. She heard a few muffled giggles from nearby pairs and felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Sarah let out an exasperated sigh, moving slightly further away from Emily. Ms. Hartley's voice rang out, sharp and critical. "Emily, you need to pay attention. Watch Sarah and follow her lead." The instructor's eyes bore into Emily, making her shrink under the scrutiny. As the warm-up continued, Emily's movements became more hesitant. The joy and excitement she had felt earlier that morning seemed like a distant memory. With each stumble and misstep, she felt her dream of becoming a dancer slipping further away. The simple box step should have been easy, but for Emily, it felt like trying to solve a complex puzzle with her feet. Ms. Hartley glided across the polished floor, her movements fluid and graceful as she demonstrated the basic dance pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted, her voice melodic and assured. "Now, children, your turn." Emily's heart raced as she attempted to mimic the instructor's steps. Her eyes darted between her own feet and the other students, desperately trying to keep up. But as she moved forward, her ankle twisted slightly, throwing her off balance. She stumbled, arms flailing as she fought to stay upright. A ripple of giggles spread through the class. Emily's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she regained her footing, avoiding eye contact with her classmates. Ms. Hartley's lips tightened into a thin line, her earlier warmth evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Emily," Ms. Hartley's voice cut through the air, sharp as a knife. "You're not paying attention. Watch my feet." The instructor demonstrated the step again, her movements exaggerated and slow. Emily nodded, determined to get it right this time, but as she tried again, her feet seemed to have a mind of their own. Left when she should have gone right, forward instead of back. The simple pattern became a confusing maze, and Emily found herself tripping over her own toes. More laughter erupted from her classmates. Emily caught sight of Sarah, her reluctant partner from earlier, whispering to another girl and pointing in her direction. The knot in Emily's stomach tightened. Ms. Hartley's patience was visibly wearing thin. Her jaw clenched as she watched Emily struggle, her foot tapping an irritated rhythm on the floor. The other children had already mastered the basic step and were moving on to more complex variations. But Emily remained stuck, unable to grasp even the fundamentals. "No, no, no." Ms. Hartley's voice rose, filling the studio. She marched over to Emily, her heels clicking aggressively against the wooden floor. "Your left foot goes back first, then to the side. How many times do I have to show you?" Emily tried to explain, her voice small and shaky. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hartley. I'm trying, but trying." Ms. Hartley cut her off, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is the simplest step in ballroom dancing. Even a child should be able to grasp it." She demonstrated once more, her movements sharp and impatient. Emily's vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus on Ms. Hartley's feet, desperate to understand what she was doing wrong. But the more she tried, the more muddled everything became. Finally, Ms. Hartley threw her hands up in exasperation. "Can't you do anything right?" she snapped, her voice echoing through the suddenly silent studio. The other children froze, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. Emily's lower lip trembled as she fought to hold back her tears. She wanted nothing more than to run from the studio, to find her mother and never come back. But a small, determined part of her refused to give up. Taking a shaky breath, she squared her shoulders and prepared to try the step one more time, even as the first tears began to slip down her cheeks. Emily's heart raced as Miss Hartley announced a new, more complex dance step. Her movements had become increasingly hesitant, each gesture tinged with the fear of further criticism. As the instructor demonstrated the intricate pattern, Emily's mind struggled to keep up. The other children nodded in understanding, but Emily felt lost in a sea of unfamiliar motions. "Now, everyone, let's try it together," Miss Hartley called out, her voice sharp with impatience. The studio burst into motion, but Emily remained frozen, overwhelmed by the instructions swirling in her head. Her eyes darted frantically from student to student, trying to grasp the steps she had missed. Panic rose in her chest as she realized she was the only one not moving. Ms. Hartley's gaze locked onto Emily, her face contorting with barely contained rage. The instructor's heels clicked ominously against the wooden floor as she strode towards the petrified girl. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body tensing as Miss Hartley drew near. Without warning, Miss Hartley's hand shot out, fingers wrapping tightly around Emily's upper arm. The grip was vice-like, bruising in its intensity. Emily let out a small gasp of pain as the instructor forcefully yanked her into position. "Like this," Miss Hartley hissed through clenched teeth, her face inches from Emily's. She roughly maneuvered Emily's body, pushing and pulling her limbs as if she were a ragdoll. How hard is it to follow simple instructions? Emily winced, tears welling up in her eyes as Miss Hartley's fingers dug deeper into her soft skin. She could feel the bruise forming, a throbbing ache that matched the pounding of her heart. The once dreamed-of dance studio had transformed into a nightmarish prison, with Miss Hartley as her cruel warden. "I'm sorry," Emily whimpered, her voice barely audible. "I'm trying, I promise." Miss Hartley's nostrils flared, her eyes flashing with contempt. She leaned in close, her words a venomous whisper meant only for Emily's ears. "You're holding everyone back. Maybe you're just not cut out for this. Some people aren't meant to dance, you know." The words cut deeper than any physical pain, slicing through Emily's fragile dreams. She felt small, insignificant, unworthy of even being in the studio. The room seemed to spin around her as she fought back sobs, desperate not to cry in front of everyone. As Miss Hartley finally released her grip, Emily stumbled backward, her arm throbbing where the instructor's fingers had been. She looked up, suddenly aware of the shocked silence that had fallen over the studio. Her classmates stood frozen, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, as they witnessed the instructor's cruelty. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emily's gaze met those of her fellow students, seeing a mix of pity, fear, and discomfort in their eyes. No one dared to speak or move, the tension in the room palpable and suffocating. In that terrible silence, Emily realized she was utterly alone. Her mother was gone, unaware of the nightmare unfolding within these mirrored walls. The dream of graceful dances and flowing movements had shattered, leaving behind only the harsh reality of discrimination and abuse. As Miss Hartley turned away, barking at the other students to continue practicing, Emily retreated to the corner of the room. She hugged herself tightly, her bruised arm a stark reminder of the ordeal she had just endured. The music resumed, but for Emily, it no longer held any joy or promise. Instead, it became the soundtrack to her shattered dreams, each note another crack in her once unshakable determination to become a dancer. Emily's quiet sobs echoed through the studio as she attempted the step once more. Her small frame trembled with each movement, muscles tense with fear and exhaustion. The other children watched in uncomfortable silence, their own practice forgotten as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Ms. Hartley's face contorted with rage as she observed Emily's clumsy efforts. The instructor's patience, already stretched thin, finally snapped like an overtuned violin string. With a snarl of frustration, she strode towards Emily, her hand raised high in the air. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she saw the impending strike. Instinctively, she flinched away, throwing her arms up to shield herself. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The threat of physical violence hung in the air like a suffocating cloud, choking out any remaining hope or joy Emily had felt about dancing. The studio fell deathly quiet, save for Emily's muffled whimpers. The other students stood frozen, torn between the urge to help and the fear of becoming Miss Hartley's next target. The once cheerful music now seemed to mock the dark scene unfolding before them. Ms. Hartley's face twisted with disgust as she glared down at Emily's cowering form. The little girl's fear seemed to fuel the instructor's anger rather than temper it. Her lips curled back in a sneer, revealing teeth clenched so tightly they might shatter. "You people never learn, do you?" Ms. Hartley spat, her words dripping with venom. The racial slur that followed hung in the air like a physical blow, shocking even the other children who had witnessed the instructor's escalating cruelty. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the room. Several students exchanged wide-eyed glances, their young minds struggling to process the hatred they had just witnessed. Even those who had giggled at Emily's earlier struggles now looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something profoundly wrong. Emily's shoulders shook with silent sobs as the full weight of Ms. Hartley's words crashed over her. The dream of becoming a dancer, which had burned so brightly just hours ago, now lay in ashes at her feet. In its place, a harsh realization began to take root, that there were people in the world who would hate her simply for the color of her skin. The studio, once a place of potential and promise, had transformed into a battlefield. The polished mirrors no longer reflected graceful movements and smiling faces, but instead captured a moment of ugly prejudice that would scar Emily's young psyche. As the seconds ticked by in agonizing slowness, no one dared to move. The air felt thick and oppressive, charged with the aftermath of Ms. Hartley's outburst. Emily remained curled into herself, a small island of misery in a sea of shocked faces and uncomfortable silence. The spell was finally broken by the distant sound of a slamming car door. Footsteps approached from the hallway, signaling the arrival of parents coming to collect their children. In that moment, a collective realization swept through the room: the outside world was about to collide with the nightmare that had unfolded within these walls. As the approaching footsteps grew louder, the air in the studio seemed to crackle with tension. How would the outside world react to the ugliness that had taken root in this supposed sanctuary of art and grace? The next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail or if silence would allow hatred to fester unchecked. Emily huddled in the corner, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. She hugged her knees tightly to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The polished wooden floor felt cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of her tears. The other children stood in clusters, their whispers filling the room with a nervous energy. Some cast furtive glances at Emily, while others stared at their feet, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Ms. Hartley's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and demanding. "Everyone, back to your positions. We'll run through the routine again from the top." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken command to pretend nothing had happened. The children hesitated, their young minds grappling with the cognitive dissonance between the horror they had witnessed and the instructor's casual dismissal of it. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to move back into formation. The sound of shuffling feet and nervous breathing filled the studio. Emily remained motionless in her corner, her face buried in her arms. She could feel the weight of stares upon her, a mix of pity and discomfort that only intensified her shame and isolation. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching into an eternity for Emily. The cheerful music that once promised joy and grace now felt like a mockery of her shattered dreams. As Miss Hartley barked out instructions, Emily's mind raced with confusion and fear. How could she face her mother? How could she explain what had happened when she herself couldn't fully comprehend the cruelty she had experienced? Minutes crawled by, each one a fresh torment for Emily. The routine continued around her, a surreal dance of normalcy in the wake of such naked prejudice. Some of the children stumbled through their steps, their concentration broken by the emotional weight of the situation. Others moved mechanically, their faces blank masks as they tried to process the events of the class. Suddenly, the sound of voices in the hallway cut through the tension in the room. Parents were arriving, ready to collect their children and hear about their day. Emily's heart raced as she recognized her mother's voice among them. Panic surged through her small body. She couldn't let her mother see her like this, couldn't bear to shatter the dream they had both held so dear. With trembling hands, Emily quickly wiped at her tear-stained cheeks. She pushed herself to her feet, legs unsteady beneath her. As she heard the studio door begin to open, Emily forced her lips into a smile that felt more like a grimace. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the redness from her eyes. The door swung open, and Emily's mother stepped in, her face bright with anticipation. "How was your first class, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice filled with the excitement that Emily had felt just hours ago. The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of how drastically everything had changed in such a short time. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she possibly explain? How could she crush her mother's hopes and reveal the ugly truth that lay behind the studio's polished facade? As she struggled to find her voice, the weight of the day's events pressed down upon her, threatening to shatter the fragile composure she had managed to cobble together. Emily's mother stepped into the studio, her face beaming with excitement. The stark contrast between her joy and the tense atmosphere in the room was palpable. "How was your first class, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Emily's heart raced as she struggled to form a response. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, a mix of pity and discomfort in their gazes. Her throat tightened, threatening to betray the emotions she was desperately trying to conceal. "It was fine," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound normal. Her mother's smile faltered for a moment as she took in Emily's appearance. The girl's eyes were rimmed with red, and there was a tension in her small frame that hadn't been there when she dropped her off. Something wasn't right, and a flicker of concern crossed her face. Around them, the other children fidgeted uncomfortably. Some exchanged furtive glances, while others stared fixedly at the floor, unable to meet Emily's mother's eyes. The air in the studio felt thick with unspoken words and barely concealed secrets. Ms. Hartley stepped forward, her face a mask of professional calm that belied the cruelty she had displayed just moments before. "Emily did very well for her first day," she said smoothly, but there was an edge to her voice that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. Emily's mother nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. She knelt down, bringing herself to Emily's eye level. "Are you sure everything's okay?" she pressed gently, her voice low and filled with concern. She reached out, gently brushing a stray curl from Emily's forehead. The touch nearly broke Emily's fragile composure. Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. She opened her mouth, the truth hovering on the tip of her tongue. The weight of the afternoon's events pressed down on her, urging her to share the pain and confusion she felt. But before Emily could speak, a small voice piped up from behind her. "Ms. Hartley was really mean to Emily." The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and accusing. Emily turned to see one of her classmates, a boy with freckles and tousled hair, step forward. His face was a mix of fear and determination as he continued. "She yelled at her and said awful things." The studio erupted into chaos. Other children, emboldened by their classmates' bravery, began to speak up. Their voices overlapped, each one eager to share what they had witnessed. Emily's mother's face transformed from concern to shock as she listened to the flood of accusations. Ms. Hartley's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Her face paled as she attempted to interject, but her protests were drowned out by the chorus of young voices. Emily stood frozen, caught between relief that the truth was finally coming out and fear of what would happen next. As the full story unfolded, Emily felt her mother's arm wrap protectively around her shoulders. She leaned into the embrace, finally allowing herself to release the emotions she had been holding back. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, confirming the children's accounts. Emily's mother's expression shifted from shock to a fierce determination. Her eyes blazed as she turned to face Ms. Hartley, pulling Emily close. The nightmare of the dance class was over, but a new chapter was about to begin, one where Emily would learn about standing up against injustice, and the power of speaking truth. The young boy's words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "Ms. Hartley was really mean to Emily," he blurted out, his voice trembling. Emily's mother froze, her eyes widening as she processed the unexpected outburst. The studio fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Suddenly, the dam broke. Other children began nodding vigorously, their voices overlapping as they rushed to share what they had witnessed. "She yelled at Emily," one girl exclaimed. "She called her names," another added, his face twisted with distress. The flood of revelations washed over Emily's mother, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Emily stood frozen, her small frame shaking as she watched her classmates expose the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. Her mother's grip on her hand tightened, a silent anchor in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Ms. Hartley's face drained of color as she listened to the children's accounts. She stepped forward, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. "Now, children, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice strained and unconvincing. But her weak protests were drowned out by the chorus of young voices, each eager to share their piece of the horrible puzzle. Emily's mother listened in growing horror as the full extent of the abuse unfolded before her. Her eyes darted between the children, Miss Hartley, and her daughter, trying to reconcile the joyful dance class she had imagined with the nightmare being described. The studio she had once seen as a place of opportunity now felt suffocating, its mirrors reflecting a twisted version of reality. As the children's stories poured out, Emily's mother felt a shift within herself. The shock that had initially paralyzed her began to give way to a simmering anger. Her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face Ms. Hartley. The instructor took an involuntary step back, recognizing the fury building in the mother's gaze. Slowly, deliberately, Emily's mother knelt down in front of her daughter. She cupped Emily's face gently in her hands, her eyes searching for the truth. "Emily, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but urgent, "is this true? Did Ms. Hartley hurt you?" The studio fell silent once more, all eyes on Emily. She stood at the precipice of a moment that would change everything. The weight of her silence pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. Emily's lower lip trembled as she looked into her mother's concerned eyes. In that instant, the facade she had struggled to maintain crumbled completely. With a heart-wrenching sob, Emily nodded. "Yes, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's true." The admission unleashed a torrent of emotions she had been holding back. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted the abuse, the harsh words, and the crushing of her dreams. Emily's mother gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her close as she wept. The other children watched in somber silence, some wiping away their own tears. Ms. Hartley stood rigidly by the mirror, her reflection a pale ghost of the confident instructor who had greeted them earlier. As Emily's sobs subsided, her mother's expression underwent a final transformation. The shock and horror gave way to a steely determination. She stood, keeping one arm protectively around Emily's shoulders. Her eyes, when they met Ms. Hartley's, burned with a fierce resolve. In that moment, it was clear that this was far from over. The truth had come out, and now, there would be consequences. The studio fell silent as Emily's mother rose, her eyes locked on Ms. Hartley. The air crackled with tension, a storm about to break. Emily clung to her mother's side, her small frame still trembling from the ordeal she had endured. "How dare you?" Emily's mother's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. "How dare you treat my daughter like this?" Her words dripped with barely contained fury as she advanced towards Ms. Hartley, who took an involuntary step back. The dance instructor's face had lost all color, her earlier bravado evaporating under the mother's fierce gaze. "Mrs. Thompson, I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding," Miss Hartley stammered, her voice lacking conviction. "Emily was simply struggling with the routine, and struggling?" Emily's mother interrupted, her voice rising. "These children tell me you yelled at her, grabbed her, called her names." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, knuckles white with rage. "Is this how you teach? By terrorizing children?" The commotion drew the attention of other parents arriving to pick up their children. They clustered at the studio's entrance, faces etched with concern and confusion. Emily's mother turned to address the growing crowd, her voice shaking with emotion. "This woman," she pointed accusingly at Ms. Hartley, "abused my daughter today. She called her racial slurs, manhandled her, and crushed her spirit." Gasps of shock rippled through the gathering. "And I have a feeling Emily's not the first child she's mistreated." Ms. Hartley's protests were drowned out by the murmurs of outrage from the other parents. Some pulled their children close, horrified at what they were hearing. Others demanded answers, their voices joining the rising cacophony of anger and disbelief. Emily's mother reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. Her fingers flew over the keypad, her jaw set in grim determination. The studio fell quiet once more, all eyes on her as she raised the phone to her ear. "What are you doing?" Ms. Hartley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's mother met her gaze, eyes blazing. "I'm calling my husband," she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends now." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the room knew Emily's father was the assistant mayor, a man of considerable influence in the city. Ms. Hartley's face, already pale, now took on an ashen hue as she realized the full extent of the trouble she was in. "Hello, David?" Emily's mother spoke into the phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You need to come to the dance studio. Now. There's been an incident." She paused, listening. "No, Emily's physically fine, but..." Her voice broke slightly. "Just get here. And bring whoever you need to make this right." As she ended the call, chaos erupted in the studio. Parents demanded to know what actions would be taken. Children huddled together, some in tears as they recounted what they had witnessed. Ms. Hartley stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. In the midst of the tumult, Emily clung to her mother, burying her face in the familiar warmth. The nightmare of her first dance class was over, but the repercussions were only beginning to unfold. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, it was clear that this was far from over. Justice was coming, swift and uncompromising. The wail of sirens pierced the tense atmosphere of the dance studio, growing louder with each passing moment. Emily's mother gripped her phone tightly, her knuckles white as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones to her husband. The other parents huddled around her, their faces a mix of shock and outrage as they listened to her recount the horrific events that had unfolded during their children's dance class. "David, you need to come now," Emily's mother hissed into the phone, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Ms. Hartley, she verbally abused Emily, used racial slurs. The other children saw everything." She paused, listening to her husband's response, her jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. Ms. Hartley stood frozen near the mirrors, her once authoritative demeanor crumbling under the weight of the accusations swirling around her. She made a feeble attempt to regain control of the situation, her voice wavering as she addressed the group. "Please, everyone, let's calm down. I'm sure we can discuss this rationally." Her words were cut short by the collective glares of the parents, their protective instincts flaring. A father stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Rationally? You think we can be rational about racism and child abuse?" His voice rose, echoing off the polished wooden floors. "My daughter will never set foot in this studio again." Emily clung to her mother's side, her small frame shaking as she buried her face in the familiar comfort of her mother's embrace. The chaos of the room swirled around them, a cacophony of angry voices and demands for justice. Through it all, Emily's mother stood firm, a pillar of strength for her traumatized daughter. On the phone, Emily's father's voice grew steely with determination. "I'm on my way," he declared, his words carrying the weight of his position as assistant mayor. "I'm bringing the police chief with me. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." The call ended, leaving a moment of charged silence before the storm of activity resumed. As if on cue, the sound of screeching tires filled the air outside the studio. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows, casting an eerie glow across the shocked faces of those inside. The first police officers burst through the door, their expressions grim as they took in the scene before them. "What's going on here?" the lead officer demanded, his hand resting instinctively on his holster as he surveyed the tense crowd. Emily's mother stepped forward, her voice clear and steady despite the turmoil of emotions raging within her. "Officer, I want to file a formal complaint against this woman," she said, pointing at Ms. Hartley. "She verbally and physically abused my daughter during her dance class today, using racial slurs and inappropriate force." The officers exchanged a look, the gravity of the situation settling over them. One of them pulled out a notepad, ready to take statements, while another moved to separate Ms. Hartley from the group of angry parents. As the chaos continued to unfold, Emily remained tucked against her mother's side, her small hands clutching tightly to the fabric of her mother's shirt. The dream of graceful dances and twirling skirts that had brought her here just hours ago now seemed like a distant memory, shattered by the harsh reality of prejudice and cruelty. But in the midst of this storm, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Justice was coming, carried on the wailing sirens and the determined voices of those who refused to let this injustice stand. As sirens wailed outside the dance studio, another storm was brewing across town. In the halls of power, a father's fury was about to unleash a whirlwind of change. What would happen when a parent's protective instinct collided with the full force of city government? David Thompson burst into the mayor's office, his face etched with grim determination. The security guards, recognizing the assistant mayor, stepped aside without a word. Mayor Jameson looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his features at the unexpected intrusion. "David? What's going on?" the mayor asked, rising to his feet. David's hands clenched into fists as he approached the desk. "It's Emily," he began, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "There's been an incident at her dance class." Over the next few minutes, David recounted the horrifying events that had unfolded at the studio. He described the racial slurs, the physical abuse, and the crushing of his daughter's spirit. With each detail, Mayor Jameson's expression darkened, his brow furrowing deeper. "This is unacceptable," the mayor growled, pacing behind his desk. "How could this happen in our city?" David leaned forward, his palms flat on the mayor's desk. "We need to take immediate action, sir. This can't be swept under the rug." The two men locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about one child or one instructor. This was about setting a precedent, about showing the entire city that such behavior would not be tolerated. "What are you proposing, David?" Mayor Jameson asked, though the glint in his eye suggested he already knew the answer. "We need to make an example of Ms. Hartley," David replied, his voice steely. "Revoke her teaching license, fine her for discriminatory practices, and launch a full investigation into the studio's operations." The mayor nodded slowly, considering the implications. "It won't be easy," he mused. "There will be pushback from certain quarters." David's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, sir, I don't give a damn about pushback. This is about protecting our children and standing up for what's right." A tense silence filled the office as Mayor Jameson weighed his options. Outside, the city hummed with its usual nighttime activity, unaware of the decision that was about to reshape its landscape. Finally, the mayor reached for his phone. "You're right, David," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll make an example of this. No one gets away with abusing children in our city, especially not with racist motivations. As Mayor Jameson dialed, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, picking up speed with each passing moment. He thought of Emily, of her tear-stained face and shattered dreams. This wouldn't undo the trauma she had experienced, but it was a start. The mayor's voice cut through David's thoughts. "Get me the police chief and the head of the education board," he barked into the phone. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." As the call connected, David knew that the coming days would be a whirlwind of activity. There would be statements to craft, press conferences to hold, and a community to reassure. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Justice was coming, and it would be swift and uncompromising. In the quiet hours of the night, as most of Atlanta slept, a storm was brewing. The story of Emily's traumatic experience at the dance studio spread like wildfire through social media, igniting a firestorm of outrage and calls for justice. As dawn broke, local news stations scrambled to cover the breaking story, their reporters descending upon the once quiet neighborhood where the studio stood. Emily sat on her living room couch, her small frame dwarfed by the cushions. Her eyes were fixed on the television screen, where images of her dance studio flashed alongside stern-faced newscasters. She hugged her knees to her chest, still struggling to process the events of the previous day. The Atlanta Police Department has launched a full investigation into allegations of racial discrimination and child abuse at the Starlight Dance Academy, a reporter announced, her voice filled with urgency. Sources close to the investigation reveal that multiple complaints have been filed against instructor Melissa Hartley. As the story unfolded on screen, the dance studio's phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. Angry parents, concerned community members, and even former students called in, demanding answers and action. The receptionist, overwhelmed by the deluge, could barely keep up with the constant ringing. Across town, in a dimly lit office, a woman named Sarah hesitated before picking up her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the number for the police tip line. I used to be a student of Ms. Hartley's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to that little girl? It's not the first time." As Sarah's story spilled out, she wasn't alone. Other former students, some now adults with children of their own, began to come forward. They shared tales of verbal abuse, discrimination, and shattered dreams that echoed Emily's experience with chilling similarity. Community leaders, galvanized by the growing scandal, called for a thorough investigation. Reverend Michael Johnson, a prominent civil rights activist, stood on the steps of City Hall, his voice booming through a megaphone. "We demand justice for Emily and all the children who have suffered in silence," he declared, as a crowd of supporters cheered behind him. Inside City Hall, Mayor Jameson's office was a flurry of activity. Staffers rushed back and forth, preparing statements and organizing logistics for an emergency press conference. The mayor himself stood by the window, his face etched with concern as he watched the growing crowd outside. "Sir," his aide said, approaching with a stack of papers. "The education board just called. They've suspended Ms. Hartley's teaching license pending the outcome of the investigation." Mayor Jameson nodded grimly. "Good. It's a start. But we need to do more. This can't happen again." As the city buzzed with activity, Emily remained curled up on her couch, watching the story of her trauma play out on the news. Her mother sat beside her, a protective arm wrapped around her shoulders. Emily's eyes widened as she saw footage of protesters gathering outside the dance studio, holding signs that read, "Justice for Emily," and "No room for racism." For the first time since the incident, Emily felt a tiny spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The nightmare of her dance class had exposed a deeper, systemic problem, and now the whole city was waking up to it. As she watched the community rally around her cause, Emily realized that sometimes, even the smallest voice could ignite a movement for change. The sun had barely risen when the first protesters began to gather outside Starlight Dance Academy. Their voices, though quiet at first, grew louder as more people joined, their signs demanding justice for Emily and accountability for Ms. Hartley's actions. By mid-morning, the crowd had swelled, their chants echoing through the once quiet neighborhood. As news of the incident spread, the dance community rallied around Emily. Local instructors, horrified by what had transpired, reached out to offer free classes to Emily and other students affected by Ms. Hartley's behavior. Their gestures of support, though small, began to chip away at the fear and distrust that had taken root in Emily's heart. The studio owner, pale-faced and visibly shaken, emerged from the building to face the protesters. His voice trembled as he read a prepared statement, distancing himself and the studio from Ms. Hartley's actions. "We are deeply sorry for the pain caused to Emily and her family," he said, his words nearly drowned out by the crowd's angry murmurs. "Ms. Hartley's behavior does not reflect the values of Starlight Dance Academy, and she has been terminated effective immediately." As the day wore on, Emily sat curled up on her living room couch, watching the events unfold on the local news. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from friends, classmates, and even strangers who had heard her story. Each ping brought a mix of comfort and anxiety, reminding her of the painful spotlight now shining on her experience. Across the city, community leaders sprang into action. Anti-racism workshops were hastily organized for local educators, aiming to prevent similar incidents in the future. The mayor's office announced a task force to review discrimination policies in all youth programs, their determination to effect change evident in every press release. That evening, as Emily picked at her dinner, her parents exchanged worried glances across the table. The question hung heavy in the air: should Emily continue dancing? Her mother reached out, gently squeezing Emily's hand. "Sweetheart," she began softly, "your father and I have been talking. We want you to know that if you don't want to dance anymore, we understand. But if you do," Emily's fork clattered to her plate as she looked up, her eyes wide. For a moment, she said nothing, the weight of the decision pressing down on her small shoulders. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "I want to try again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But not there. Not with her." Her parents exchanged relieved smiles, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Of course, baby," her father said, his voice warm with pride. "We'll find you a new studio, with a teacher who will appreciate you for who you are." As Emily climbed into bed that night, she felt a mix of fear and excitement fluttering in her stomach. Tomorrow, they would begin the search for a new dance studio. The dream that had been so violently shattered was slowly, carefully being pieced back together. As she drifted off to sleep, Emily allowed herself to imagine twirling across a sunlit studio floor, her movements graceful and free. Emily stood frozen outside the new dance studio, her hand clutching her mother's tightly. The building looked friendly enough, with its cheerful yellow exterior and large windows, but Emily couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice warm and encouraging. "You've got this, sweetheart," he said softly. "Remember, this is a fresh start." Emily nodded, trying to draw strength from her parents' presence. As they pushed open the glass doors, the familiar scent of wood polish and sweat filled her nostrils. For a moment, she was transported back to that terrible day at Starlight Academy. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt her mother squeeze her hand reassuringly. The studio buzzed with activity as children of all ages warmed up along the bar. Emily's eyes darted around, taking in the colorful leotards and the excited chatter. Then, she saw her. A tall woman with close-cropped silver hair was making her way towards them, a warm smile lighting up her face. Emily tensed, memories of Ms. Hartley's false kindness flooding back. She took an involuntary step backward, bumping into her father. The woman stopped a respectful distance away, her eyes kind as she addressed Emily directly. "You must be Emily," she said, her voice gentle but not patronizing. "I'm Ms. Johnson. I'm so glad you decided to join us today." Emily managed a small nod, still wary. Ms. Johnson's smile never faltered as she continued, I know it might feel a bit scary being in a new place, but I promise you, everyone here is excited to dance with you. As if on cue, a group of girls around Emily's age approached. Their faces were open and curious, without a trace of the judgment she had feared. One girl with wild curly hair grinned broadly. Hi, Emily, she chirped. I'm Zoe. Do you want to warm up with us? Emily glanced up at her parents, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and turned back to Zoe, managing a shy smile. Okay, she said softly. As Emily stepped away from her parents, Ms. Johnson clapped her hands together. All right, everyone. Let's get started. Find your places on the floor, please. The opening notes of a lively piano piece filled the air. Emily felt a momentary panic as she realized she didn't know where to go. But before she could retreat, Zoe grabbed her hand. Come on, she said, tugging Emily gently. You can stand next to me. Emily allowed herself to be led to an open spot on the floor. She glanced around, noticing the other students smiling at her. There was no judgment in their eyes, no whispers or pointed fingers. Just a group of kids ready to dance. Ms. Johnson moved to the front of the class, her movements fluid and graceful. Okay, dancers, she called out. Let's start with some simple warm-ups. Emily, just follow along as best you can. Remember, we're all here to learn and have fun. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Ms. Johnson. As the instructor began to move, Emily tentatively followed along. Her first steps were hesitant, her body stiff with nerves. But as the music flowed around her, she felt something starting to shift. With each movement, the tension in Emily's shoulders began to ease. She found herself mirroring Ms. Johnson's graceful gestures, her body remembering the joy of dance that had been buried beneath layers of fear and pain. And then, almost without realizing it, a small smile crept onto Emily's face. It wasn't perfect. Emily stumbled once or twice, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But each time, she caught Zoe's encouraging grin or Ms. Johnson's approving nod. Slowly, the knot in her stomach began to unravel, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest. As the class continued, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. This wasn't just a new studio or a new teacher. It was a chance to reclaim her love of dance, to heal the wounds inflicted by cruelty and prejudice. With each step, each twirl, Emily was dancing her way towards a brighter future. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as Emily stepped onto the stage, her sequined costume catching the light. Months of hard work had led to this moment, her first recital since that fateful day at Starlight Academy. As she took her position, Emily's eyes scanned the crowd, landing on her beaming parents in the front row. But it wasn't just her family watching. The mayor himself sat a few rows back, his presence adding an air of importance to the evening. The music swelled, and Emily began to move. Her steps were confident, her arms graceful as she twirled across the stage. Gone was the timid girl who had once cowered in fear. In her place stood a dancer filled with joy and determination. As Emily leapt and spun, the audience watched in awe, captivated by her performance. When the final notes faded away, the auditorium erupted in applause. Emily's chest heaved as she took her bow, a wide smile spreading across her face. As she exited the stage, she caught sight of her father giving her a thumbs up, his eyes glistening with pride. After the recital, the mayor took to the podium. His voice rang out clear and strong as he addressed the crowd. Tonight, we've witnessed not just beautiful performances, but the triumph of the human spirit, he began. In light of recent events, I'm proud to announce new anti-discrimination policies for all youth programs in our city. A murmur rippled through the audience as the mayor continued, outlining plans for mandatory diversity training for instructors and a comprehensive review of existing programs. Emily listened intently, her heart swelling with each word. Her story, her pain, had sparked real change. As the mayor spoke, Emily's thoughts drifted to Miss Hartley. News had broken earlier that week of the former instructor's permanent license revocation. The decision had brought a mix of emotions for Emily: relief, vindication, and a twinge of sadness for the woman who had nearly crushed her dreams. The mayor's voice brought Emily back to the present. "But we're not stopping there," he announced. "I'm pleased to reveal a new scholarship program for underprivileged dancers, established in honor of a brave young girl who refused to let adversity dim her light." Emily's jaw dropped as she realized the mayor was talking about her. She turned to her parents, confusion and excitement warring on her face. Her father wrapped an arm around her shoulders, leaning down to whisper, "Surprise, sweetheart. Your courage is going to help so many other kids follow their dreams." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes as the magnitude of the moment washed over her. From the depths of despair, she had risen to inspire change that would ripple through the entire city. As the audience applauded the mayor's announcement, Emily felt a surge of determination. She may have started as a victim, but now she stood as an inspiration. With her head held high, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. There would be more dances to learn, more stages to conquer, and most importantly, more children to inspire. As she looked out at the sea of faces before her, Emily realized that her love of dance had become something far greater, a beacon of hope for others who might face the same challenges she once did. Emily's journey from a frightened child to a beacon of hope resonated far beyond the dance studio. Her courage in speaking out against injustice sparked a movement, proving that even the smallest voice could ignite profound change.